All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to my talk today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the evolution of ESXi Ransomware. So I'm Lindsay Kaye, and I'm Vice President of Threat Intelligence at Human, and my technical specialty and passion is reverse engineering and malware analysis. So first, ESXi servers are a super attractive target for threat actors, so both your state-sponsored and financially motivated for a couple of reasons. So first, a lot of organizations are actually moving away from having a lot of on-premises infrastructure towards more virtualized infrastructure. Then, this often holds centralized or really super operationally critical data source for the organization, so stuff the organization really kind of needs to operate on a daily basis. And they're a little bit easier to victimize than your traditional Windows systems for a few reasons. So first, security tools specifically designed just for ESXi are much more nascent than a lot of the Windows tools and counterparts that you might be familiar with. Then, VMware specifically recommends not using third-party tools, so a lot of those third-party AV stuff that you can think about. And it's a little bit more challenging to implement security measures, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And finally, these ESXi servers might be subject to less scrutiny than a lot of your endpoints. So why is it so challenging to secure ESXi? So we think a lot about our traditional detection strategies for a lot of our Windows endpoints and things like that, but they don't necessarily translate as easily to ESXi. So first, if you think about it, a threat actor who's adequately privileged to victimize the ESXi server can probably also clear the logs of malicious indicators. So if you think about using kind of your Sigma rules on the ESXi logs, maybe substantially less useful than it would be if they couldn't clear them. Then AV and EDR for ESXi is substantially less mature and doesn't really kind of exist to the same magnitude as Windows. And while some researchers have talked about how you can implement YAR rules on these systems, it's feasible, but it's substantially clunkier than doing so on Windows. And we all talk about how patching is super critical as kind of a security approach. But it does present some unique challenges for ESXi. So first, a lot of downtime for these critical systems or infrastructure is probably significantly less tolerable than it would be for your users' endpoints, based on kind of the data and purpose that these servers serve. And there's the potential for software interoperability issues, especially if you have some sort of program or tool that's designed specifically to work on a particular version of ESXi. So here's just an excerpt from VMware's own documentation, further emphasizing that they really don't want you to be using those third-party tools on their systems. So now that we kind of understand why it's appealing, let's talk about how threat actors can and do attack ESXi. So I've taken kind of a kill chain and divided it into sort of 4 main categories here, with the first being discovery. So this will be something like you either have a particular target in mind that you want to go after, or you want to find somebody that might be vulnerable to your attack. So you probably are familiar with the first 3 tools kind of from the system administration perspective, and you maybe even use them yourself in everyday life. And Shodan and Census, also pretty familiar and easily accessible online. Then, for initial access, largely what threat actors will use for ESXi, they exploit vulnerabilities. There's a wide variety of them if you want to go look those up. And credentials. So these are eternally popular, can be bought and sold on the dark web, or acquired from a variety of sources. Then, for post-exploitation activity, so you can see a bunch of openly available post-exploitation toolkits. So SharpSphere is a great example there. And there are a couple ESXi backdoors that have been released probably about the last year that I'll talk about on the next slide. And then finally, we dropped the ransomware. So these backdoors have been used by both state-sponsored and cybercriminal threat actors. So the first one I want to draw your attention to is the very simple Python backdoor published by Juniper about last year. And very simply, what it did was create a web server, receives and runs commands, and can launch a reverse shell. Remember this one. Then, Mandiant talked about 2 particular backdoors, Virtual PITA and Virtual Pi. And what was particularly interesting about them was how they use VMCI for lateral movement and persistence. So pretty much what this is a very ESXi-specific utility that allowed the threat actor to regain access to the ESXi host, as long as they had access to the guest VM. So get kicked off the host, but you still have access to the VM. You're able to get back into the host and potentially the other parts of the network. And also interesting was how they installed it. So what they did was they modified something called the vSphere installation bundle acceptance level in order to install it. So what this looks like is this. So if you think about the acceptance level as effectively the level of kind of signing that you would need to be able to install something on the ESXi server, with VMware certified being kind of the tightest level of control, what the threat actor was able to do, change the acceptance level to reduce it, and then install the malware. So kind of interesting there. So how does this kind of all come together, and kind of like what could an ESXi-specific attack look like? So here's just kind of an example of how this could go down. So first, threat actor will gain access to potentially the Windows network. And what they'll want to do there is probably do Active Directory enumeration, potentially using Bloodhound or Sharphound. Then what they want to do is they want to go through this data. So what they want to do is figure out the network layout. Is there any naming convention or description in AD that could give them any clues here? So they might do this to identify if there's an ESXi server or where that is. Then, using something like advanced IP scanner to figure out more about the ESXi server, maybe where it is, and figure out how they could potentially gain access. Then, in order to actually gain access, what they'll do is, as I mentioned, they'll exploit some vulnerabilities, or if they found any sort of credentials in other part of the network or acquired them in some other way, they might just log in. So now they're on the ESXi server. So a variety of things that they could do here, but for example, let's say they would drop a backdoor. So they could use this for things like persistence, or if they want to exfiltrate any data that they could use to leverage for extortion purposes, something like that. And they'll also drop the locker. So at this point, what you do is you enable the root account and run the locker, and then you're off to the races. So this is just kind of one example. So threat actors could do a variety of other things if they want. So again, exfiltrated data, or looking for additional credential material, what have you. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about ESXi-specific ransomware. So ESXi lockers and kind of their predecessors, Linux-specific lockers, are really not a new thing. So as early as 2015, we kind of saw the first Linux-based lockers, and they really started to pick up in 2021, 2022, and even today we see new versions being released. So these first lockers for ESXi, and specifically Linux in this case, Linux encoder, was relatively ineffective. So as you know, one of the key parts of ransomware is making the victim pay the ransom to get their stuff decrypted. Unfortunately, all three versions of Linux encoder were subject to some cryptographic flaws, so researchers were able to put out decryptors that didn't require the victim to buy the key. So not really wildly effective. So then a couple years pass, and 2020 comes. So at the time, Defray 777 was a big group, and they had a Windows locker at the time. What happened then is they ported this to Linux and became the first ransomware group to have both a Windows and Linux locker that was quite big. So about a year later, DarkSide, who has rebranded as Black Matter and now Alpha, who I'm sure you're all very familiar with, and Defray 777 both became the first big ransomware groups at the time to specifically target ESXi. So not just Windows and Linux, but specifically ESXi. So if you've analyzed a lot of like Windows malware or particularly Windows lockers, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the functionality and some of the differences that you'll see in ESXi lockers versus those Windows ones. So kind of at a high level, they're generally a single native code ELF executable. Kind of along with the times, they're written in Go, Rust, C, and C++ in general. There's also some that are a combination of a shell script and then an executable, where the shell script has a lot of the logic and runs the executable to do the actual encryption. So ESXi args, I'm sure we all heard of that. That's a great example of that. And if you've looked at a lot of Windows malware, generally it's a lot of kind of Windows API calls. That's kind of just how they work. On the contrary, the ones for ESXi are generally not. So effectively what these things do is they function as sort of a wrapper for ESX CLI and Linux shell commands. So not really kind of that heavy use of an API. It's kind of one key difference. But there are also some other kind of key differences in specifically what you won't see. So for a while, a lot of Windows ransomware had the popular language or region check. So looking for countries that were in the Commonwealth of Independent States, if they found the victim was there, they wouldn't run. So this has died down somewhat, but have not observed that in an ESXi locker. Also looking for and shutting down AV is pretty popular, but not as much risk on ESXi, so really nothing to shut down that would make encryption harder or take longer. Then, privilege escalation. So sometimes you'll find your Windows lockers have a baked-in privilege escalation. So like UAC bypass is a great example there. Generally, the ESXi lockers are deployed after the threat actor already has root access. Also, anti-VM checks, kind of the same thing. ESXi really kind of less of a risk there. And finally, I'll talk more about this, but having the high levels of obfuscation and anti-RE techniques that you often see with Windows ransomware, not as much in ESXi. So if you kind of have looked through the control flow of your general kind of Windows locker, I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like on ESXi. It's a little bit different, but overall pretty similar. So first, what a lot of these ransomware will do, they'll look for any running VMs and shut them down. So as you're probably aware, if you try to encrypt a VM without shutting it down first, you run the risk of corrupting it. So that's quite bad for business because if the victim pays the key and you can't decrypt their VM, not great. So after doing that, sometimes you'll see them delete VM snapshots. So this is analogous to the deletion of shadow copies on Windows. So ultimately functions to make recovery harder because they can't just revert some of those snapshots. Then, pretty similar to Windows, kill any running processes that might interfere with the encryption process, just kind of make it quicker and make it actually effective. Then looking for and deleting any sort of the data stores that are attached to the host. Either you just want to delete them or you want to encrypt them differently, depending kind of what you want to do. Then the encryption happens. So if you've looked at Windows lockers, you'll often see them find specific files not to encrypt. So generally EXEs, DLLs, and anything else that's kind of critical to the operation of the computer. Because ultimately, you want the victim to see the node and their computer to operate well enough, but all their files are encrypted. So here, generally what you'll see is they have a specific list of file extensions that they actively want to encrypt. Pretty much just serves the same purpose. Then, a lot of them will do some sort of cleanup. So this might be deleting any log files, deleting the binary itself, anything else that they've sort of left behind, just getting rid of it. And they'll put the note, most importantly, on the system. So message of the day is pretty popular. Some of them put a home directory, some of them put them every directory. Really kind of just depends what the threat actor is going for. So a couple of different trends, kind of with ESXi lockers, but the larger ransomware space as a whole that I want to talk about. So the use of minimal obfuscation and anti-reverse engineering techniques in ESXi. So even if the Windows counterparts were super obfuscated, had a lot of stuff going on there, generally I've seen the ESXi ones don't. I'll talk about why. Also the move to new languages. So previously it was just kind of C and C++, and over the past couple of years, what we've seen is threat actors transitioning to Go and now Rust. And I'm going to talk about the impact of code leaks on the ransomware space, specifically the Babuk code that was leaked in the past year. So why is there no obfuscation? So in short, it's really not super needed. Largely the point of having any sort of obfuscation is to evade AV when you drop the locker so that it automatically doesn't just get kind of quarantined and you can actually execute it, and to evade any sort of detection tools that are installed. So like I mentioned, this is not really a super huge issue for ESXi, so not necessarily worth the investment. And I know we talk a lot about, oh, it makes reverse engineering harder, but largely we know that reverse engineering will happen anyway, probably. So it's not necessarily as worth the investment as it would be to just evade the AV or detection tools. However, some threat actors have made some simple attempts, and some have made some slightly more complex ones. So for simple attempts, both LockBit and the Golang Hive samples from about 2021 used kind of XOR-based ciphers. So nothing wildly complicated there, just kind of a little bit more than nothing. But the one that I really want to talk about that was really interesting to me was Alpha's Morph toolkit. So Morph, when it was released, was advertised as this toolkit that would provide automated garbage code insertion and then string encryption. Great. So I looked at the Windows version, behaved as promised, just kind of a pretty simple XOR for the string encryption, but fine. And then I looked at the Linux one. It did not actually deliver as promised, and was particularly interesting. If you look at the bottom picture on the slide, you can see almost like C++ name-mangled function names kind of inserted back. So you can see like locker, core, stuff like that. So pretty sure that wasn't necessarily intended, but kind of interesting. So if you look today, they still have the Windows version available, but their Linux and ESXi one is no longer offered. So pretty familiar with Golang and Rust at this point, I believe, but part of the benefit of writing your code in either one of these languages is cross-compilability. So you can get your Windows, Linux, or even an ARM locker if you want from one set of code, and you don't have to maintain several different code bases. So a little bit logistically easier. In terms of Rust, Alpha was kind of the first big ransomware locker that was written in Rust, and that was late 2021. So previously, a popular stealer, Thicker Stealer, was written in Rust, but there really wasn't any ransomware until Alpha debuted theirs. So some threat actors who even had Golang lockers started transitioning to Rust as well. For example, Hive. So they transitioned about early 2022 until they were taken down by the FBI in the US in 2023. But that's not to say that you don't see the more kind of traditional languages. So C and C++ are still used and still pretty popular. So if you're familiar with some of these ransomware groups, CheerScript, AvisLocker, BlackBasta, and Royal are a couple examples that are written in C and C++ to this day. So let's talk about kind of that leaked ESXi locker code. So some researchers talked about how they've observed some actors that look like they're using the leaked code. So for example, some have some very direct similarities, so really very likely that it is based on this code, if not taken directly. So a couple of them, you can see those names there. And the researchers talked a little bit about how they observed things like Conti and Revel having very kind of similar code that seems inspired by it, but a little bit less conclusive there. And why we care about this is it makes it a lot easier for an aspiring threat actor to get into the ransomware space for a couple of reasons. So first, if you're not super technical, but you want some ransomware, this code's ready to go. You can take it, build it, and then you can go execute your ransomware attacks. So you really don't need that kind of higher level of skill, and the barrier to entry goes down. Or if you have some technical skill, you can use this as a great starting point. So it just lets you focus on adding those new features. You don't have to worry about the directory traversal logic or any sort of the crypto stuff there. You can kind of just start with this and then add those features that you want. Then this also makes an opportunity for more variants. So we as defenders have to kind of start looking for, all right, well, what are these new variants here, and start keeping track of them there. Just kind of widens the space itself. So kind of how does this come together? So I want to talk about how easy it is to kind of get started in executing your own ESXi attacks from the mindset of a criminal by talking about the ESXi attacks from earlier this year. So they kind of serve as a great example for what somebody with just kind of some enthusiasm and illegal aspirations can kind of get going. So first, you want to find some victims. For example, what you could do is fire up Shodan, look for some VMware ESXi servers that are on the internet. All right, now that you've found some victims, what you want to do is get in. So while it's not necessarily known what CVE was used in these attacks, there are a variety of them, and it's suspected that the threat actor used really any vulnerability that they had access to. So the great part about this is you can look up a particular vulnerability and put POC, so proof of concept after it, into Google, and then you get a bunch of kind of different examples. So maybe you take one of these, you try a couple, you find something that works. Now you're in. So what you might want to do is you might want to drop a backdoor. So if you get kicked out of the network, you want to make sure that you can get back in. So linked to the ESXi attacks was that Python backdoor that I mentioned that Juniper published on about 4 months earlier. So it looks like this code, pretty similar. Potentially the threat actor borrowed it from the internet. And it's kind of interesting to note that even that code seems to have borrowed the reverse shell command from the reverse shell one-liners cheat sheet. So borrowing is pretty popular. So now you drop that, and now you have a persistence mechanism. So next what you need is a locker. So wide variety of opportunities there. You can write your own if you have the technical skills, or you can kind of choose from the myriad of available code on the internet. So you write your locker, you drop it, you run it on some victims, and now what you do is you go on the internet to see what a great job you've done. So you go on the internet just like the rest of us, and then you see some researchers have published ESXi recover. Gee, what is that? And one of the things that they talked about was the specific mistake the threat actor made in the kind of cryptographic process based on the size of the chunks they were encrypting at once. So they highlighted this specific error, as you can see on the right. The threat actor can read it, and then they fixed it in a subsequent version. So threat actors, they're just like us. They also read the internet. So I hope this gives you kind of like a sense of how easy it is to kind of conduct some of this stuff when you're thinking about your own kind of security systems and security postures. So now what? Maybe ESXi isn't something we super care about, but I feel like we have to talk about what we do. But it's really not just about ESXi here. So one of the big things about it is that it provides access to the rest of the network. So first, if you find any credentials laying around on the server, so system administrator nodes, bash history, anything like that, potentially could be used to move laterally or on other parts of the network, if they're the same. It also functions to establish persistence, as I mentioned with the virtual PITA and virtual Pi backdoors. If you have access to the VM, can get back to ESXi, potentially other parts of the network there. Then you're also bypassing your Windows or host security controls, so those may be super great, but not really as kind of monumental when you're on ESXi. And now you also have access to the virtualized file shares and servers at a very high privilege level at the highest. So it's also worth noting that it's not just the ESXi lockers. So this is just kind of one part of a potential ransomware attack, and they can be used in conjunction with your Windows or other lockers as the threat actor sees fit. So a couple of ESXi-specific mitigations, so sort of 4 main categories I want to cover today. So first, authentication and authorization. So this is really figuring out how to reduce the risk of something like credential access and reuse. So again, strong passwords, MFA, prudent audit accounts, we all kind of know about that. But also looking for things like unusual account modifications, any sort of weird authentication patterns you're observing, or enabling services you don't expect. Then, figuring out ways to reduce the attack surface. So how do you limit which specific services this host can connect to? Can you disable shell and SSH access just to kind of reduce the attack surface there, if it's possible? And if you have the kind of interest, energy, and kind of team to kind of do it, performing some sort of internal threat hunting is not a terrible idea, particularly to assess for misconfigurations. So really just trying to make sure that everything is configured the way you expect. You can see or not see other servers or things like that or other parts of the network in the way that you expect. Then VMware offers 2 kind of great built-in utilities for software attestation to kind of help with that. So first, enabling secure boot. So I talked about the installation mechanism used by virtual PITA and virtual Pi, where they alter the VIB acceptance level. This could potentially prevent that. So thinking about that there, as well as using TPM 2.0 if possible. And then finally, monitoring logging. This is kind of a great security principle in general, but for ESXi-specific things, I talked about how using Sigma on kind of those ESXi logs probably less useful, but there's really nothing stopping you from doing so on your Windows hosts. So looking for any scanning tools or suspicious other tools that might be trying to find an ESXi server might be a great idea, or for your web server logs as well. Then looking for any sort of unusual behaviors. So for ESXi, that's snapshot creation or deletion, or touching, so clearing or resetting the logs there. And some kind of just general ransomware mitigations as well. So I like to talk about how trying to detect the ransomware attack when the ransomware drops is way too late. So how do you move it as kind of prior to that attack as possible? So starting with initial access. So are there any relevant vulnerabilities that you can patch in general? So not for your ESXi server alone necessarily, but other parts of your network. Looking into credentials that are being bought and sold on the dark web for your organization. So a threat intelligence platform might help here, or some other method of doing so. And educating your kind of users on SEO poisoning. So things that are purporting to be fake updates or downloads could potentially kind of lead to ransomware attacks. So that's definitely worth paying attention to. And we can also put some effort into detecting some of those openly available or commodity tools. So people still use these because they work and they're pretty effective. So focusing some of your detection energy here, so Cobalt Strike, any of those red team tools, Interpreter, things like that. And while things like lolbins or PowerShell are pretty hard to detect because of their kind of benign uses, they have a lot of functionality that threat actors really like to take advantage of. Then, looking for different kinds of anomalous traffic, so a couple recommendations here. Any sort of failed logins, or if you see large amounts of data transferred, especially if it's going to like a suspicious or malicious IP and at a strange time, might be worth looking into. And finally, if you are concerned about ransomware, consider having some sort of ransomware preparedness plan. So this would be something that would kind of have guidance for any sort of backups that you might do, an incident response plan, and a disaster recovery plan. So what's next? So ransomware is not going to go away, unfortunately. But what we expect to see is more variants that are going to be emerging from any of these builders that have been leaked and any of the code that's been leaked. So here's an example from VX Underground of all these builders that you can just kind of download for a variety of malware. Pretty easy to get. We expect to see continued rebranding. So just because groups kind of go away doesn't mean they're gone. So they'll go away, rebrand, spin up again as someone new, and continue conducting attacks. And in terms of ESXi ransomware, we expect these attacks to continue and probably even increase as threat actors see it as a viable opportunity to make some money, because that's ultimately what they are after. Thank you so much.